Vladimir Putin is one of the most tactically cunning leaders of the modern era. He is patient, he is methodical. He understands how to exploit frozen conflicts, energy dependencies, separatist movements, and the West's fear of escalation to extract maximum geopolitical leverage from minimum direct cost. For 3 decades, that playbook worked. It worked in Chechnya, it worked in Georgia, it worked in Crimea in 2014, so-called people's republics that bled Kiev's resources and kept Ukraine out of NATO. And it was working in Transnistria, that thin, bizarre strip of land wedged between Moldova and Ukraine, home to a Russian military contingent that has been illegally stationed there since 1992, a permanent thorn in Moldova's side, a useful tool for threatening Ukrainian rear areas, and a ready-made justification for Russian intervention anytime Moscow felt like turning the pressure up on Chisinau. But something went wrong with the Transnistria gambit. Something went very wrong. And by the spring of 2026, what was supposed to be one of Putin's most powerful geopolitical levers had instead become a trap, one he walked into himself, one he cannot easily escape, and one that is systematically dismantling 30 years of Russian strategy in southeastern Europe. To understand the trap, you have to understand what Transnistria actually is, because most people have never heard of it, and the ones who have often misunderstood its strategic purpose. Transnistria is a narrow strip of territory on the left bank of the Dniester River, formerly part of Moldova, but controlled since 1992 by pro-Russian separatist authorities who declared independence after a short war in which Russian forces directly supported the separatist militia against the Moldovan government. The conflict produced approximately 500 deaths and hundreds of thousands of displaced people, and it ended not in a peace agreement, but in a ceasefire that left the conflict frozen for more than 3 decades. No country in the world, including Russia, officially recognizes Transnistria as an independent state. It is internationally recognized as part of Moldova, but it has its own government, its own currency, its own military forces, and a permanent garrison of Russian troops that Moscow calls peacekeepers and the rest of the world calls an illegal occupation force. For 30 years, that garrison has been Moscow's insurance policy in the region, a tool to keep Moldova destabilized, out of NATO, and fearful of moving too decisively toward the European Union. The strategic logic behind Transnistria was elegant in the way that all of Putin's strategic thinking is elegant at the surface level. You park a military force inside a country that cannot remove it without triggering a war it cannot afford. You use that force's presence to signal that any Western integration attempt by that country could lead to conflict. You use the separatist region's economic dependence on Russian energy subsidies to give yourself leverage over the broader country's political direction. And you keep the whole thing frozen. Not resolved, not escalating, just frozen. Indefinitely, because a frozen conflict serves Moscow's interests better than any outcome. Resolution means you lose the lever. Escalation means you pay a cost. Freezing means you keep the lever forever at minimal ongoing expense. It is a playbook Russia has used from Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia to the Donbass in Ukraine, and for 3 decades it worked in Transnistria like clockwork. Then Ukraine ended the gas transit contract, and everything changed. Here is the specific mechanism of the trap, because it is important to understand exactly what happened and why Putin could not prevent it. Transnistria's entire economic model for 30 years was built on a single foundation: free Russian natural gas delivered via pipeline through Ukraine into the breakaway region. Russia's Gazprom was supplying this gas under arrangements that effectively made it free, or nearly free, for Transnistria. The breakaway region used this gas to fuel its Kusyurgan power plant, the largest electricity generation facility in all of Moldova, and then sold electricity back to Moldova proper at below-market rates. This arrangement gave Transnistria export revenue, kept its population's utility bills artificially low, and gave Moscow a permanent economic subsidy mechanism that cost relatively little to maintain. It also gave Russia leverage over Moldova's broader electricity supply, since the Kukurgan plant was supplying a significant portion of Moldova's power. As long as that gas kept flowing, Transnistria could function as a quasi-state, pay its government workers, subsidize its heavy industry, and maintain the fiction that it was a viable independent entity under Russian protection. Ukraine ended that fiction on January 1st, 2025. The transit agreement between Russia's Gazprom and Ukraine's Naftogaz expired at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Day. Ukraine had been warning since 2023 that it would not renew the contract, that allowing Russia to earn transit fees and maintain energy leverage over European customers while simultaneously using that revenue to fund a war against Ukraine was something Kiev was not willing to facilitate any longer. Russia had the option of rerouting gas to Transnistria through the Turk Stream pipeline and the Trans-Balkan route, which runs through Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. It chose not to. Western analysts, the Moldovan government, and the Carnegie Endowment all concluded the same thing. Russia deliberately refused the alternative route because it calculated that an energy crisis in Transnistria would destabilize Moldova, fuel public discontent, and help bring down the pro-European government in Chisinau before Moldova's 2025 parliamentary elections. In other words, Russia intentionally cut off its own client territory to use the resulting suffering as a political weapon against Moldova. That decision was the first step into the trap. What actually happened next was not what the Kremlin planned. The energy crisis hit Transnistria with devastating severity. Nearly all industrial enterprises in the region were forced to close, with the exception of food producers. The Moldova Steelworks in Ribnica, one of Transnistria's largest employers and a major source of export revenue, went idle. The Kuchurgan power plant stopped generating electricity. The heating infrastructure across the region struggled to function in the middle of a European winter. The breakaway administration declared an economic state of emergency. CNBC described a profound energy crisis in the region. Balkan Insight reported that the region had been thrust into potentially humanitarian crisis conditions. The Carnegie Endowment noted that the crisis exposed the deep fragility of Transnistria's economy and the unreliability of its Russian patronage. And the numbers that followed confirmed just how devastating the impact was. Transnistria's economy contracted by 18% in 2025 alone. Industrial production collapsed by 30%. Inflation hit nearly 15%. Per capita GDP fell to just 4,150 euros, compared to 7,250 euros in Moldova proper, meaning that by 2026, residents of Russian-protected Transnistria were significantly poorer than residents of the Moldova they had spent 30 years refusing to rejoin. Meanwhile, in Moldova, something the Kremlin had not anticipated happened. The pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity, led by President Maia Sandu, held its ground. A pro-Russian party into power in the September 2025 parliamentary elections, reversing Moldova's Western integration trajectory and giving Moscow a political ally in Chisinau. That calculation failed. The PAS won the elections with a reduced but still workable majority. Moldova had, over the preceding years, diversified its energy supply with EU assistance. It was buying electricity from Romania, sourcing gas from non-Russian suppliers, and integrating into European energy networks. The weapon Russia chose to use against Moldova bounced off, and the enclave Russia had used as a lever against Moldova for 30 years was left broken and economically crippled. With no gas and no functioning industrial sector, while the country it was supposed to destabilize moved forward with EU accession talks. The CSIS published a blunt analysis of what this meant. Until January 2025, it wrote, Transnistria's economic model was built on the fiction of viability as an independent entity. The region's survival depended entirely on free Russian natural gas, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars annually. With that gone, the fiction was over. The CSIS concluded directly, January 2025 marked a significant shift when Russia's decision to weaponize energy backfired, exposing the fragility of Transnistria's economy and the unreliability of its Russian patronage. Moldova, it noted, now held unprecedented leverage. The Carnegie Endowment put it even more starkly, laying out the two possible futures facing Transnistria: withdrawal of Russian troops and reintegration with Moldova, or transformation into a Russian military outpost with no economy and few inhabitants. One of those outcomes is a solution. The other is a slow-motion catastrophe that benefits nobody. Not Russia, not Transnistria, not Moldova, not Europe. And then Moldova made its move. In February 2026, Moldova's government drafted a comprehensive plan for the reintegration of the Russian-occupied Transnistrian region and presented it to Western partners in March. The first such official government document since Moldova rejected Russia's Kozak plan back in 2003. Deputy Prime Minister Valeriu Ceveri brought the plan to Brussels and met with European Commission Enlargement Commissioner Marta Koss and other senior EU officials. The document proposed imposing uniform fiscal rules on Transnistria unilaterally, creating a convergence fund for political concessions, and advancing EU accession with Transnistria's EU law integration suspended for a defined period. In plain language, Moldova was proposing to treat Transnistria as a part of Moldova that had not yet come back, rather than as an independent entity to be negotiated with as an equal. And Western partners were listening. The EU, which had previously been cautious about linking Moldova's accession to the Transnistria question, was showing signs of shifting its position to handle Moldova's accession as one entity, rather than deferring Transnistria's status indefinitely. The Kremlin's response to all of this has been a combination of desperation and familiar manipulation. Putin signed a decree simplifying access to Russian citizenship for Transnistrians, the same passport distribution tactic Russia used in South Ossetia before the 2008 Georgia War, in Crimea before 2014, and in the Donbas before 2022, each time using the presence of Russian passport holders as justification for intervention or pressure. Russia's State Duma approved legislation expanding presidential authority to deploy Russian armed forces abroad for the protection of Russian citizens, language that mirrors exactly the justifications Moscow used in previous interventions. Russian diplomats intensified contacts with Transnistria's de facto authorities, publicly discussing peacekeeping and Russian Transnistrian cooperation. And Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, the HUR, reported that Moscow was boosting military mobilization in Transnistria and had established drone production and training centers in the region. On paper, this looks like Russia preparing to escalate. In practice, it looks like Russia is trying to use the old playbook to rescue a position that the old playbook has already failed to hold. The fundamental problem for Putin in Transnistria is geographic, and it is one he cannot solve no matter how many passport decrees he signs. Transnistria is not Crimea. It is not connected to Russia by any route that Russia controls. To resupply, reinforce, or rescue the Russian military contingent in Transnistria, Moscow would need to move forces through either Ukraine or Moldova, both of which are now aligned against it. Ukraine has made clear it will treat any military movement through its territory toward Transnistria as a direct security threat requiring an adequate response. Moldova has been steadily tightening its restrictions on the Russian military presence, and its government has been increasingly explicit about describing the Russian troops as an illegal occupation force. The Russian garrison in Transnistria, estimated at between 1,000 and 2,000 personnel, along with Transnistrian forces, is surrounded on all sides by hostile or aligned Western territory. With no land corridor to Russia, no air corridor that Ukraine would permit, and no sea route that does not pass through Black Sea waters that Russia no longer controls. Ukraine's destruction of the Black Sea Fleet has, among other things, removed the option of a maritime resupply route to Transnistria's western coast via the Danube Delta. The Kremlin enters this situation also facing a domestic political calendar that makes the Transnistria problem even more awkward. Russia's State Duma elections are scheduled for September 2026, the first parliamentary elections since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. The Kremlin enters that cycle facing economic stagnation, growing social fatigue from wartime mobilization, a declining rate of military recruitment, and a war in Ukraine that is visibly not going according to the timelines Putin promised. In that context, a dramatic escalation in Moldova, sending troops, claiming a humanitarian mission, trying to create a land corridor through Ukraine, would carry enormous risk. A failed intervention would be catastrophic for domestic political purposes. A successful one would require military resources that Russia is currently burning at a rate of 35,000 casualties per month on the Ukrainian front. The military capacity to open a second major front in Moldova simply does not exist in any form that Russian military planners can act on without catastrophically overstretching an already overstretched army. What the passport decree and the Duma legislation actually represent, in the cold light of strategic analysis, is not preparation for intervention. It is a domestic political theater. The Kremlin uses these symbolic moves for the September elections. They are, as Kiev Post's analysis noted, inexpensive, visually effective, and ideologically familiar. They look strong on Russian state television. They suggest Putin still has moves to play in the region. They feed the narrative of Russia as protector of Russians wherever they live. But they do not change the fundamental reality on the ground in Transnistria, which is that the region's economy has contracted by 18%, its industry has collapsed by 30%, its people are poorer than their neighbors in Moldova proper, its Russian patron cannot supply it with gas or reinforce its military garrison, and the country that holds the reintegration plan is moving steadily toward the European Union. The propaganda is not the strategy. The propaganda is what you deploy when the strategy has already failed. The German Marshall Fund analysis, published in March 2026, captured an extraordinary paradox that tells you exactly where this is heading. It noted that Transnistria is becoming more economically integrated with Moldova, in practice, even as its official political model becomes less viable. Transnistrian firms are increasingly operating through Moldovan registration and customs channels. Trade is predominantly oriented toward the European Union. The new Moldovan CU STOMS code, which requires companies in Transnistria to pay customs duties directly to the Moldovan state, had 2,478 registered economic agents from the region by December 2025. These are not abstract geopolitical trends. These are businesses making practical decisions about where their economic future lies. And they are looking at Moldova and Europe, not at Moscow. The separation that Russia worked for 30 years to maintain is being dissolved not by military force or political negotiation, but by economic gravity. The simple fact that in 2026, the European economic orbit offers something functional and the Russian orbit offers an 18% economic contraction and empty gas pipelines. For Putin, the specific irony of the Transnistria trap is that the very instrument he used to try to preserve his leverage became the mechanism of its destruction. For 3 decades, free Russian gas flowing through Ukraine was the economic life support of Transnistria's artificial existence. It was the subsidy that kept the fiction alive, kept the population from demanding reintegration, kept the heavy industry running, and kept Moscow relevant. When Ukraine cut the transit in January 2025, Russia had a choice. It could reroute the gas through Turkey and save its client, or it could refuse to reroute, bet that the resulting crisis would destabilize Moldova's pro-EU government and maintain the fiction of Transnistrian viability through some future political deal it hoped to engineer. Putin chose the bet. The bet failed. Moldova's pro-EU government survived. Transnistria's economy collapsed. And Moldova, with EU backing, is now at the table presenting a reintegration plan to Brussels, while Russia's frozen conflict lever rusts in the corner useless. This matters far beyond Transnistria's borders because it is a case study in what happens when Putin's frozen conflict playbook meets the combination of Ukrainian strategic action and Western institutional solidarity. The playbook requires certain conditions to work. It requires the host country to be too fragile to absorb the economic shock of losing Russian subsidies. It requires the West to be too divided to provide an alternative. It requires Ukraine to be too consumed with its own war to close off the energy transit route. By January 2025, none of those conditions existed anymore. Moldova had EU energy support. The West had a line behind Chisinau. Ukraine refused to extend the gas transit. The 3 pillars of the Transnistria playbook all collapsed simultaneously, and the 30-year frozen conflict began finally to thaw, not in Russia's favor, but against it. The Carnegie Endowment summarized where things stand with a sentence that should be read in the Kremlin as a strategic obituary for 3 decades of effort. Russia's grip on Transnistria has never been weaker. Its troops isolated, its gas leverage gone, and its trade routes sealed. That is the state of Putin's Transnistria gambit in 2026. The troops are isolated. The gas leverage is gone. The trade routes are sealed. The economy of the client territory has collapsed. The host country is advancing toward the EU with a reintegration plan in hand. And the man who built this particular lever of geopolitical pressure, by exploiting a frozen conflict for 30 years, is sitting in Moscow, signing passport decrees and watching legislation pass the Duma, neither of which changes a single fact on the ground. He played the Crimea card in 2014, and the world handed him a peninsula. He played the Transnistria card for 30 years, and Ukraine and Moldova handed him a trap. The difference between the 2 outcomes tells you everything about how this geopolitical era is ending.